Maya was born under the twin moons of Zerathia, on a night when the crystal mountains glowed with a strange purple light. Her mother was the queen of the northern forests, a powerful elf warrior who had defended her lands for nearly 500 years. Her father was a scholar and a teacher, a gentle soul who loved books and the ancient knowledge of their people. Maya inherited strength from her mother and curiosity from her father, and these two qualities would shape her entire life. From the moment she could walk, she was different from other young elves. She did not want to stay in the comfort of the crystal cities. She wanted to explore, to fight, to test herself against the world. When Maya turned 15 in the elf years, which was still young for her kind, her mother decided it was time for her formal training as a warrior. The queen took her daughter deep into the heart of the forbidden forests, places where few elves ever ventured. The trees there were ancient and massive, some of them so old that they had been growing since before mankind had even discovered fire on distant Earth. The light could barely penetrate the thick canopy above. Everything was dark and damp and filled with the sounds of creatures that did not belong to the cities or the gentle parts of the forest. "Your training will not be easy," the queen told her daughter as they walked through the darkness. "I will teach you to fight with weapons, yes, but more importantly, I will teach you to survive. Survival is what separates the warriors from the dead. You must learn to read the land, to understand the animals, to know when danger is coming before it arrives. You must learn to move through the world without being seen, and to strike when the moment is right." For 2 years, Maya trained under her mother's careful instruction. She learned to use the curved sword that had belonged to generations of their family. She learned to shoot arrows with perfect accuracy from hundreds of feet away. She learned to move silently through even the crackling undergrowth of the forest. She learned to climb the tallest trees and leap between branches high above the ground. Her body became stronger and faster and more capable than she had ever thought possible. Her mind became sharper, more focused, more aware of everything happening around her. But despite all this training, Maya felt something was still missing. She was good at fighting, yes, but the real warriors, the ones she read about in the ancient stories, they had something more. They had companions. They had partners who shared their burdens and their victories. Some of them had great beasts as allies. Some of them had people who would fight beside them no matter what. Maya was alone, and she knew that being alone would limit what she could accomplish. One morning, when she was 17 years old in elf years, Maya woke to hear a strange sound echoing through the forest. It was a cry that seemed to come from pain and fear and rage all mixed together. She knew immediately that she should report it to her mother, but instead, she grabbed her sword and ran toward the sound. Her mother had taught her better than this, but something in her heart wanted to know what was making that terrible noise. The sound led her to a hidden valley that she had never seen before, despite all her explorations. In the center of the valley, surrounded by a pack of wild hunting beasts, was a dragon. But it was not like the dragons she had read about in books. This dragon was small, maybe only 15 feet long from nose to tail, and it was covered in wounds. Its scales were dull and cracked. One of its wings hung at a strange angle, clearly broken. The hunting beast circled closer and closer, preparing to strike the killing blow. Maya did not think about what she was doing. She simply ran forward and screamed as loud as she could, her sword held high above her head. The hunting beasts, startled by the sudden noise and the figure charging at them, hesitated for just a moment. That moment was all the dragon needed. It breathed a small stream of flame, not very powerful, but enough to scare the beasts away. They scattered into the forest, yelping and growling. Maya reached the dragon and stood between it and where the beast had disappeared. "Are you all right?" she asked the dragon, though she knew the creature could not understand her words. The dragon looked at her with eyes that seemed ancient and sad and wise all at once. It made a small sound, something between a purr and a rumble, and lowered its great head toward her. Maya reached out her hand, not knowing if this was the smartest thing to do, and touched the dragon's snout. The moment her skin made contact with the dragon's scales, something extraordinary happened. Images flooded into her mind, not words but feelings and pictures and sensations. She understood that the dragon's name was Zephyr. She understood that he had been hunting and had stumbled into the territory of a great beast that was now hunting him. She understood that he was hurt and afraid and desperate. Maya looked at the broken wing and knew she could not heal it by herself. She helped Zephyr stand up, supporting his weight as much as she could, and led him slowly back through the forest toward the Crystal City. It took hours, and by the time they arrived, Maya was exhausted. Her mother saw them coming and immediately ran to her daughter, worried that something terrible had happened. But when the queen understood what had occurred, she simply smiled. She had been waiting for this moment her entire life. She had known that one day her daughter would find a dragon, or that a dragon would find her. Zephyr was taken to the healing chambers beneath the city, where the best healers worked their ancient magic. They used herbs and spells passed down from the earliest days of their people. They used techniques that combined science and art in ways that humans from Earth would have found impossible to understand. Slowly, over many weeks, the dragon's wing healed. The wounds on his body closed and faded away. His scales began to shine again with their natural deep purple color. And through it all, Maya stayed with him. She brought him food. She spoke to him. And though the dragon could not understand her words, he understood her presence and her care. When Zephyr was finally strong enough to fly, he did not leave. Instead, he followed Maya everywhere she went. The bond that had formed between them grew stronger every day. The queen explained to her daughter that this was a rare thing, a gift that came to only a few elves in 1,000 years. A dragon would only choose to bond with a human if that human possessed something special inside them. It meant that Maya was meant for great things. It meant that she had been chosen for a purpose that neither of them could yet understand. 3 months after Zephyr arrived, a second dragon appeared at the gates of the Crystal City. This one was smaller than Zephyr, with scales that shifted between midnight blue and pure black depending on how the light hit them. The dragon was also young, also wounded, also desperate. Maya recognized the signs immediately because she had seen them in Zephyr. She went to the gates and placed her hand on this new dragon's snout. Just as she had done with Zephyr, the connection was instant and powerful. This dragon's name was Onyx, and she had lost her family to hunters who wanted to capture and sell young dragons to wealthy collectors across the stars. Onyx became part of their group just as naturally as Zephyr had. The three of them, the elf girl and her 2 dragons, began training together. Maya's mother taught them all to work as a team, to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, to move together as one unified force. Zephyr was larger and more powerful, but Onyx was faster and more agile. Maya was the connection between them, the one who could think and plan and decide on the best strategy for any situation. As the years passed, Maya grew from a girl into a young woman. Zephyr and Onyx grew larger and stronger, becoming magnificent creatures of power and grace. The 3 of them fought together against the dangers that threatened the peace of Zerathia. They faced wild beasts that had never been tamed. They fought against bandits and criminals who preyed on innocent elves. They defeated warlords who came from distant lands seeking to conquer the crystal cities. And with each battle, their bond grew deeper and stronger, until it seemed like they could read each other's minds even without speaking. But peace could never last forever in a dangerous universe. The day came when scouts brought news that a great fleet of ships had been spotted beyond the protective barriers of Zerathia. The ships belonged to an organization called the Dominion, humans from a civilization that had conquered dozens of worlds. They were coming to take the crystal mines, and they did not care about the lives of the elves who lived here. They did not care about the ancient forests or the magical culture that had flourished for thousands of years. They only cared about power and resources and wealth. The queen called a great assembly of all the elf warriors and leaders. She told them that war was coming, that they would soon have to fight for their very survival. Many of the elves were afraid, for they had lived in peace for so long that many of them had forgotten what true war was like. But when Maya stood up and placed her hands on the shoulders of Zephyr and Onyx, something changed in the hearts of her people. They saw the young warrior queen with her 2 magnificent dragons, and they felt hope return to them. If Maya could fight, then they could fight too. If Maya was not afraid, then they did not need to be afraid either. So began the preparations for what would become the greatest battle in the history of Zerathia. The elves gathered their weapons and their magic. The days grew shorter and colder as the Dominion fleet approached Zerathia. The queen declared martial law throughout all the crystal cities, and every able elf was called upon to contribute to the war effort. Some worked in the forges, creating weapons and armor from the rare metals found in the deep mines. Others prepared food and medical supplies. Still others worked on fortifications, building walls and barriers that might slow down the Dominion soldiers if they managed to land on the planet's surface. Maya spent most of her time in the high places above the cities, where she could see the dark shapes of the Dominion ships as they grew steadily larger in the night sky. There were 40 ships in total, ranging from massive carriers to sleek attack fighters. The Dominion military was highly organized and incredibly advanced. Their weapons could vaporize rock from hundreds of miles away. Their soldiers wore armor that could withstand most conventional attacks. Their technology was centuries ahead of anything the elves possessed. But the queen had a secret weapon, or rather, she had 3 of them. Maya and Zephyr and Onyx had spent the last 3 months training in ways that pushed all three of them to their absolute limits. They practiced tactical flying patterns that would allow them to avoid the Dominion's energy beams. They worked on coordinated attacks that took advantage of the dragon's natural abilities and Maya's tactical thinking. They learned to move faster and react quicker than anyone would have thought possible. One morning, as Maya was eating breakfast in the royal halls, a messenger arrived with urgent news. The Dominion had sent a transmission to the Queen, demanding that the elves surrender immediately or face complete destruction. They were offering a choice, though calling it a choice seemed cruel. The elves could abandon their homes and their crystal mines and leave the planet, or they could stay and be annihilated. The Dominion would attack at sunrise the next day. The Queen looked at her daughter across the breakfast table. The expression on her face was calm, but Maya could see the worry in her ancient eyes. "You understand what this means," the Queen said quietly. "Tomorrow we find out if all of our training and preparation has been enough. Tomorrow we find out if our people will survive, or if this will be the end of everything we have built." Maya stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, she could see the crystal city glowing with its natural inner light. The buildings were shaped like towers that reached toward the sky, and they sparkled with every color of the rainbow. The streets were peaceful and beautiful, filled with elves going about their daily lives, trying to act normal despite the knowledge that tomorrow everything would change. "I will not let them take this world," Maya said, her voice steady and determined. "I have a bond with Zephyr and Onyx that is stronger than any technology the Dominion possesses. I will fight with everything I have, and I will win or I will die trying. But I will not let our people be destroyed without putting up the greatest fight they have ever seen." The Queen stood and embraced her daughter. She was proud of Maya, and she was also terrified. She had lived for over 500 years and had seen many wars and many dangers. But this felt different. This felt like it might be the greatest threat that Zerathia had ever faced. That night, Maya went to where Zephyr and Onyx were sleeping in the great cavern beneath the city. The two dragons were intertwined with each other, their scales glowing softly in the darkness. When Maya entered, they both lifted their heads immediately. They always knew when she was near, no matter how quietly she approached. "Tomorrow is the day," Maya said to them. "Tomorrow the Dominion will attack, and we will have to fight the greatest battle of our lives. I need you both to trust me completely. I need you to be brave and strong and ready to do things that have never been done before." Zephyr stood up and walked over to Maya. He lowered his massive head until his snout touched the top of her head. In that moment, Maya felt the full depth of his trust and his commitment. Zephyr had chosen her, had bonded with her, and he would follow her to the very ends of the earth and beyond. Onyx joined them, wrapping her smaller body around them both. The three of them stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other, preparing themselves for what was to come. That morning before dawn, Maya dressed in her ceremonial armor. The moonstone material was beautiful and deadly, cool against her skin. She buckled her sword at her side and climbed onto Zephyr's back. Onyx took to the sky beside them. The two dragons flew upward through the cavern system until they burst into the open air above the crystal city. The sky was still dark, but they could see the Dominion ships on the horizon, their engines glowing with a sickly yellow light. The other elf warriors had gathered in the streets below, looking up at their young queen with hope and fear mingling in their hearts. This was their moment. This was when everything would be decided. The Dominion ships grew closer and closer, and then without warning they opened fire. The first volley of energy beams shot down from the sky like terrible lightning. The elves had built shields, magical barriers that had been carefully constructed over weeks of preparation. The shields held mostly, but several buildings were damaged. The Dominion ships descended lower, pouring more and more firepower down onto the city. The shields flickered and cracked but continued to hold, protected by dozens of elf mages who poured their magical energy into maintaining them. And then Maya gave the signal. Zephyr and Onyx shot forward like arrows launched from invisible bows. They moved so fast that the Dominion pilots barely had time to react. The smaller attack fighters tried to intercept the dragons, but they were no match for creatures that had been flying and fighting for over a decade. Zephyr opened his mouth and unleashed a torrent of flame that engulfed 3 of the attack fighters at once. They fell from the sky like burning stars, their pilots having no time to eject. Onyx used her smaller size and greater maneuverability to weave between the Dominion weapons. She struck at the ships with her claws, tearing into their hulls. She breathed fire that melted through armor and technology alike. But the Dominion had not conquered dozens of worlds by being unprepared for unexpected threats. They quickly adapted their tactics and began coordinating their fire toward the dragons. Maya held on tightly to Zephyr as they dodged and wove through the endless barrage of energy beams. It was like flying through a forest of lightning. One beam came close enough that she felt the heat wash across her face. Another beam singed one of Zephyr's wings, and the dragon roared in pain and anger. But Zephyr did not falter. He continued fighting with every ounce of strength he possessed. Onyx took a beam directly across her side, and the impact knocked her out of the sky for a moment. She fell like a stone before recovering and launching herself back into the air. Maya's heart clenched with fear and desperation. Her dragons were being hurt, and she was powerless to prevent it. All she could do was keep fighting, keep believing that they would somehow find a way to win this battle. The fight raged for hours. The Dominion ships were slowly forced higher into the sky as the dragons proved again and again that they would not be easily defeated. The elf warriors below were doing their part too, firing arrows and spells at the few Dominion soldiers who managed to land on the ground. Some of the buildings in the Crystal City were burning now, and many elves had been wounded, but they were holding their ground. By midday, the Dominion had lost a significant portion of their attack fighters, but they still had the massive carriers, and those ships packed weapons that made everything else look like toys. The largest carrier opened fire with a weapon that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. It was a concentrated beam of pure energy, massive and impossibly powerful. It struck the ground and created a crater that was hundreds of feet across. Maya realized in that moment that they could not win through force alone. They had to do something unexpected, something the Dominion would never anticipate. She made a decision that would either save her people or doom them forever. "Zephyr," she called through their bond, "I need you to do something for me. Something that will hurt. I need you to fly directly at the largest carrier and trust me completely." "Can you do that?" Zephyr responded with determination and courage. He turned his body toward the massive ship and began flying straight at it, accelerating faster and faster. The Dominion weapons locked onto him and began firing. Energy beams struck him repeatedly, scorching his scales and making his wings scream in pain, but he did not turn away. He kept flying toward the ship, getting closer and closer with every passing second. Onyx realized what Maya was doing. She flew on the other side of Zephyr, drawing the Dominion fire toward her as well. She was being brave, being loyal, being willing to sacrifice everything for her sister and her bonded warrior. And Maya, standing on Zephyr's back as they flew at the carrier at impossible speeds, began to feel the ancient magic of her people awakening within her. It was magic that had not been used in thousands of years. Magic that was forbidden because it required such a terrible price to use. But Maya was beyond caring about the price. Her world was under attack. Her people were dying. Her dragons were suffering. She would pay any price to save them. The Dominion captain on the bridge of the flagship watched in growing alarm as the dragon with the elf warrior on its back came charging toward them like a comet. The captain had conquered 7 planets. She had fought alien species that had evolved for millions of years. She had faced robots and soldiers and weapons of every imaginable type. But she had never seen anything like this. The dragon was glowing with an impossible light, and the energy radiating from it was off every meter and sensor they had. "Fire every weapon we have," the captain commanded, her voice sharp and precise. "Do not let that dragon reach us." Nothing in her training or experience had prepared her for an opponent like this. She knew only that this was a threat that had to be eliminated. The main carrier unleashed a storm of firepower. Hundreds of energy beams shot out simultaneously, filling the sky with an avalanche of deadly light. It was enough to vaporize mountains. It was enough to destroy small cities. It should have been more than enough to stop one dragon, no matter how large or unusual. But Zephyr and Maya had transcended the limitations of normal physics. The beams passed through them without causing damage, as if the dragon and rider had become creatures of pure energy themselves. Zephyr flew through the fire as though it did not exist. His wings extended to their full magnificent span. Onyx was right beside him, and she too seemed to be operating on a plane of reality that was beyond the Dominion's ability to harm. The Dominion soldiers began to panic. Their weapons were not working. Their technology, which had always been superior to whatever primitive species they encountered, was proving useless against this enemy. The captain saw the fear in the eyes of her crew and forced herself to remain calm. Fear would kill them faster than anything else. "All hands, prepare for impact," she said through the ship's communication system. "This is not a drill. Brace for impact." The crew scrambled to take protective positions. Some of them put on emergency harnesses. Others ran to the reinforced core of the ship. Nobody had time to evacuate, and there was nowhere to evacuate to anyway. The Dominion flagship had been built to withstand attacks from other ships and planetary weapons. It had never been designed to withstand a direct impact from a creature like Zephyr. Maya raised her sword high above her head. The blade had been forged thousands of years ago in furnaces powered by the ancient magic of her people. It had been passed down through generations of queens and warriors, and it had never failed in the hands of someone pure of heart and true in their purpose. Now that blade began to glow with the same light that had consumed Maya and her dragons. The collision was unlike anything any living being had ever witnessed. Zephyr's massive body struck the carrier's hull with tremendous force. The impact registered on instruments across the planet. Buildings swayed. The ground shook. The sky itself seemed to split open. Maya's sword, augmented by power that should not have existed in the physical universe, pierced through the carrier's armor as if it were nothing more than silk. The energy that had been building up inside Maya and her dragons exploded outward in a wave of pure magical force. The wave traveled through the ship, destroying everything in its path. Computer systems fried. Weapons fell silent. Bulkheads collapsed. The Dominion soldiers died instantly, their bodies unable to withstand the energies that tore through the vessel. The massive carrier began to fall from the sky. It had been damaged beyond any possibility of repair. Its engines shut down. Its structure was compromised. There was nothing that could be done to save it. The ship descended slowly, a titanic monument to the power of the bond between an elf and her dragons. But the cost was terrible. Maya felt the ancient magic drain out of her, leaving her weaker and more vulnerable than she had ever been. Zephyr felt his strength fade as well, his wings suddenly becoming heavy and difficult to control. Onyx cried out in pain and exhaustion. The magical connection that had united them began to unravel. The two remaining Dominion carriers saw what had happened to the flagship. They saw the massive ship falling from the sky. They saw the two dragons that had seemed invincible suddenly become mortal again, and they understood that they could still win. If they attacked now while the elf and her dragons were weakened, they could still defeat this enemy. The second and third carriers opened fire simultaneously. Dozens of energy beams streaked through the sky. Zephyr managed to dodge some of them, but a beam struck him on the left wing. The dragon roared in pain as his scales cracked and charred. He began to fall. Maya grabbed his mane and held on desperately. She was exhausted and weakened from using the ancient magic, but she refused to let go. If Zephyr fell, then they would all fall. If Zephyr died, then her people had lost. Onyx threw herself between her bonded warrior and the next volley of beams. The smaller dragon was struck multiple times, her body scorched and bleeding, but she held her position, protecting Maya and Zephyr with her own body. She was suffering terribly, but she did not retreat. She did not give up. She would die before she would abandon her family. The Dominion soldiers watched in amazement as the dragons continued to fight despite their injuries and exhaustion. They had never encountered creatures with this level of loyalty and courage. In all their years of conquering worlds and enslaving species, they had never seen anything like this. Zephyr recovered from his fall and managed to get back into the air. His wing was damaged but still functional. He flew toward the nearest remaining carrier, moving more slowly now, his wounds making every movement painful. Onyx limped alongside him, her scales matted with blood and char, but something else was happening. Down in the Crystal City, the elf warriors had seen what Maya and her dragons had accomplished. They had seen the massive flagship brought down. They had seen their young queen standing against overwhelming odds and refusing to surrender. The fear that had gripped many of them began to transform into determination and courage. The elf mages gathered their power and began to cast a spell that had not been used in recorded history. It was a spell that would require the sacrifice of several of them, but it might give the dragons the opening they needed. The mages began to chant in the ancient language of their people. Magic flowed out of the city like a tidal wave. The spell created a massive barrier in the sky that reflected the Dominion's energy beams back at their own ships. The second carrier was struck by multiple beams from its own weapons. Explosions rocked the ship and it began to develop critical problems. Its engines overloaded. Its shields failed. Fire broke out in the lower sections. The third carrier tried to maneuver away from the reflected fire, but it was too slow. Several beams struck it as well, and now both remaining ships were damaged and falling. Maya felt something change inside her. The weakness that had consumed her after using the ancient magic began to fade. It was replaced by a new kind of strength. A strength that came not from forbidden power, but from the bond between her and her dragons, and the love of her people. She could feel the prayers of thousands of elves reaching out to her through the magical connection that bound all of their kind together. She drew her sword again, though it no longer glowed with that terrible magical light. But it did not need to. Her sword was powerful enough on its own. Everything she had was powerful enough. She had something that the Dominion could never understand. She had a people who believed in her. She had dragons who loved her. She had a world worth fighting for. Zephyr and Onyx seemed to feel the change as well. Their movements became more fluid and confident. The pain of their wounds receded into the background. They were tired, yes, and hurt, but they were not defeated. They would not be defeated as long as the bond between them remained unbroken. The young queen and her 2 dragons launched one final attack against the remaining carriers. It was not as spectacular as the collision with the first ship had been. It was not powered by forbidden magic, but it was effective. It was pure and true and unstoppable in its determination. One by one, the remaining Dominion fighters fell from the sky. The Dominion soldiers who had landed on the ground found themselves facing elf warriors who had been inspired by what they had witnessed. The elves fought with ferocity and skill that the Dominion had not anticipated. They knew this was their world, their home, their future. They would die rather than let it fall. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the Dominion realized they were being defeated. The remaining intact carrier sent out a distress signal and began to retreat. The Dominion soldiers on the ground who had not been killed began to fall back toward their landing sites. Some of them tried to escape. Others surrendered when they realized their situation was hopeless. Maya guided Zephyr down to land in the central plaza of the Crystal City. The 2 dragons touched down gently, exhausted and wounded, but alive. Onyx landed beside them, and the 3 of them stood together as the elf people began to emerge from their shelters and gather around them. The elves began to cheer, a sound that started as a whisper and grew louder and louder until it filled the entire sky. They had won. Against all odds, despite being outgunned and outmaneuvered, they had won. The victory was not complete, not yet. There were Dominion ships still in orbit around the planet. There were soldiers still to be dealt with. The healing chambers beneath the Crystal City became the center of activity in the days following the first battle. The healers worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded elves and the injured dragons. Zephyr had taken the brunt of the Dominion's attacks, and his body was covered in wounds that would have killed any creature without magical assistance. Onyx was in similar condition. Her scales cracked and burned, her wings torn in several places. But both dragons were alive, and that was what mattered. Maya refused to leave their sides. She sat between them in the healing chambers, one hand resting on Zephyr's neck and the other on Onyx's side. The healers tried to convince her to rest, to allow them to tend to her own wounds, but she would not move. She had to be there for her dragons. They had fought for her and her people. The least she could do was stay with them while they recovered. The queen came to the healing chambers on the 2nd day after the battle. She looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Maya had aged in just 2 days. The weight of leadership and the strain of using ancient magic had taken a toll on her. But there was also a strength in her that had not been there before. She had proven herself in battle. She had proven that she was worthy of being the leader of her people. "The Dominion is still out there," the queen said without preamble. "We have reports of 3 more carriers approaching from the edge of the system. They will be here within 6 days. We thought you should know." Maya looked up at her mother. She wanted to feel fear, but instead she felt only determination. They had won once. They would win again if necessary. The Dominion would learn that they could not simply take what they wanted from Zerathia. There was a price to be paid for attempting to conquer an elf world with dragons protecting it. "How long until Zephyr and Onyx can fly again?" she asked the head healer, an elderly elf named Aurora who had been healing creatures for over 800 years. Aurora considered the question carefully. "Normally, I would say at least 2 weeks. But your dragons are special. They have a will to recover that I have not often seen. If they rest without stress and eat well, they might be ready to fly again within 10 days. but they will still be weakened. They will not be at full strength for at least 3 weeks. Then we have 10 days to prepare, Maya said. We need to double the fortifications. We need to gather more weapons and supplies. We need to train more warriors. And we need to rest ourselves and heal from our wounds. When the Dominion returns, they will come with greater numbers and stronger weapons. We need to be ready for anything. Over the next 10 days, the Crystal City became a place of intense preparation. The elf warriors trained in formations designed to take advantage of their smaller size and greater agility. The mages practiced spells that could create barriers and defenses against energy weapons. The craftspeople worked in the forges and workshops, creating new weapons and armor from materials that had been stored in the mines for thousands of years. Maya spent much of her time in the war room with her mother and the other military leaders. They studied reports from their scouts who had been observing the Dominion ships in orbit. The 3 new carriers that were approaching seemed to be even more heavily armed than the previous ones. The Dominion was taking the threat seriously now. They had sent a message to the Elf Queen, demanding that she surrender within 7 days or face total annihilation. The Queen had read the message to the assembled leaders, and the response had been unanimous. They would not surrender. They would fight to the last elf and the last dragon if necessary. On the 10th day, Zephyr and Onyx emerged from the healing chambers. They were still not fully healed, but they were well enough to move around and exercise their wings. Maya took them to one of the high platforms above the city and watched as they practiced their flight patterns. Zephyr still moved with some pain, and his left wing showed visible damage that had only partially healed. But his eyes were bright and alert, and when he looked at Maya, she could feel his determination through their bond. Onyx was in better condition, her smaller wounds having healed more quickly. She flew in circles around the platform, practicing sharp turns and sudden changes in altitude. Tomorrow the new carriers arrive, Maya said to them. We will have to fight again. I know you are still healing. I know you are still hurt, but I need you to trust me. I need you to believe that we can win. Zephyr landed on the platform and lowered his head to touch Maya's forehead with his snout. Through their bond, he sent her images and feelings that did not need words to be understood. He was ready. He would always be ready. There was nothing she could ask of him that he would not do. Onyx landed beside them, and the 3 of them stood together as the sun began to set. Below them, they could see the lights of the Crystal City coming to life as evening fell. They could see elves moving through the streets preparing for the coming battle. They could see the hope and fear and determination that filled their people. The Dominion carriers arrived just after dawn the next morning. There were 3 of them, and they were truly massive, even larger than the ships that had come before. They took up position in orbit above the planet, and immediately, they sent a signal demanding the surrender of the elf population. The Queen rejected the demand within seconds. The battle began with an even more intense barrage of fire than the first one had been. The Dominion had learned that the shield spells required constant focus from multiple mages to maintain. They concentrated their fire on specific points, trying to break through at least one section of the protective barrier. The elf mages poured everything they had into holding the shields, but the Dominion's weapons were incredibly powerful. Cracks began to appear in the barriers. Some of the outer buildings in the Crystal City were destroyed as portions of the shields failed. The Dominion soldiers began to land assault transports on the planet's surface, preparing to invade on the ground while their ships attacked from above. This was the moment Maya had been waiting for. She was standing on the edge of the highest tower in the city, ready to take to the sky. Zephyr and Onyx came running toward her, their wings unfurling as they prepared for flight. They had trained together for 2 weeks to use new tactics designed to exploit the damage the previous battle had inflicted on the Dominion fleet. The Dominion ships had armor plates that had been damaged in the first battle and had not been fully repaired. There were weak points in their defenses. There were sections where the weapons were not as heavily protected. If Maya and her dragons could strike at those weak points before the Dominion could repair them, they might be able to cripple the ships more quickly than they had before. Zephyr took to the sky first with Maya riding on his back. Onyx followed, and the 2 dragons climbed higher and higher until they reached the altitude of the Dominion carriers. The battle intensified as soon as they appeared. The Dominion had been expecting them. This time, they had positioned their defense fighters in formations designed specifically to intercept the dragons. Dogfights broke out in the sky as Zephyr and Onyx engaged the smaller, faster Dominion fighters. The dragons were at a disadvantage at first, their larger size making them easier targets. But as the battle progressed, their superior maneuverability began to show. Zephyr flew in patterns that the Dominion pilots could not follow. He would dive down suddenly and then climb almost vertically, forcing the fighters chasing him to struggle to keep up. Several of them could not manage it and fell out of formation. Onyx used her smaller size to slip through gaps in the Dominion formations, attacking from unexpected directions. But Maya knew that this was just the opening move. The real battle would happen when they engaged the carriers themselves. She guided Zephyr toward the nearest carrier, watching carefully for the weak points they had identified. The ship's left side had been damaged in the previous battle, and several armor plates were loose or missing entirely. That was where they had to strike. Zephyr pushed himself harder than he ever had before, despite his injuries still not being fully healed. He flew through a storm of fire, taking several grazing hits that burned his scales. Onyx was right with him, distracting the ship's weapons by making sharp turns and sudden maneuvers. They reached the damaged section of the carrier's hull. Maya raised her sword and prepared herself mentally for what she was about to do. She would not use the ancient magic again. That was forbidden, and the price was too high. But she could use the bond between herself and her dragons. She could channel their combined will and determination into a strike that would be devastating in a different way. Zephyr aligned himself perfectly with the damaged armor plates. Maya felt the moment of connection with her dragons, the moment when all three of them became unified in purpose. She struck with her sword. And though she did not use magic, the strike carried the weight of 3 souls acting as one. The blade penetrated the armor plating and struck something vital within the ship. Explosions erupted from the carrier's interior. The ship's engines began to fail. Internal damage spread throughout the vessel. The Dominion had built these ships to be resilient and hard to damage, but they had not anticipated this kind of attack. They had not expected a young elf woman and 2 dragons to figure out exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. 3 weeks passed, and the people of Zerathia began to hope that perhaps the Dominion would not return. The wounds of the city were slowly healed, and new buildings rose to replace those that had been destroyed. The elf warriors continued to train, but there was less urgency to their drills. Some people began to whisper that maybe the Dominion had decided to leave them alone, but Maya knew better. She could feel it in her bones, in the connection she shared with her dragons, in the way the wind seemed to shift with a warning. The Dominion would return. They would return with everything they had, with all their power and all their anger at having been defeated twice by what they considered a primitive civilization. The message came through the Dominion communication channels 3 weeks and 2 days after they had retreated. It was not a demand or a threat. It was simple and direct. The Dominion was sending their entire remaining fleet to Zerathia. They were committing their full military might to the conquest of the planet. They were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to annihilate. The Queen called an emergency assembly of all the elf leaders. They gathered in the Great Hall beneath the Crystal City, a chamber that had been used for thousands of years as the place where important decisions were made. The Queen stood at the center of the assembly and announced what the scouts had reported. The Dominion was sending over 100 ships, carriers and fighters and support vessels. It was more firepower than any single elf world could possibly hope to resist. Some of the leaders began to suggest surrender. They said that fighting was hopeless, that Maya and her dragons had done everything they could, but that there were limits to what could be accomplished against such overwhelming odds. But Maya stood up and walked to the center of the chamber. She was young by elf standards, but there was an authority in her presence that silenced the doubters. "We will not surrender," she said, her voice carrying across the entire chamber. "We have proven twice that we can defeat the Dominion. We have proven that dragons and elves together are more than a match for their technology. Will it be a difficult battle? Yes. Will many of us die? Probably. But if we surrender now, we give up everything our ancestors fought to build. We give up our freedom. We give up our world. I would rather fight and die as a free elf than live as a slave to the Dominion." The other leaders looked at each other, and slowly, one by one, they stood up. They stood in support of Maya. They stood in support of continuing the fight. The assembly dissolved into planning sessions as every elf who was capable of fighting began to prepare for the final battle. Zephyr and Onyx had fully recovered from their wounds by now. They spent their days practicing new flying patterns and attacks. They worked with Maya to develop strategies for dealing with a fleet that was 5 times larger than the one they had faced before. The three of them had developed a level of coordination that was almost supernatural. They could read each other's intentions without words. They could anticipate each other's movements. They had become not just partners but true extensions of each other. The night before the Dominion fleet arrived, Maya went to the high tower above the Crystal City and looked out at the stars. The Dominion ships were already visible as points of light against the darkness. There were so many of them. Even with all their training and preparation, the odds seemed impossible. Zephyr and Onyx came to stand beside her on the tower. The three of them looked out at the approaching fleet together. Maya reached out and touched the soft scales on the inside of Zephyr's wing. Through their bond, she sent him feelings of love and gratitude and absolute determination. These dragons had chosen to stay with her when they could have left. They had fought and bled and suffered beside her. They were more than just her companions. They were her family. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said to them, "I want you to know that I love you both. I want you to know that being bonded to you has been the greatest gift of my life. If tomorrow is the day we fall, then I will fall fighting beside you." Both dragons pressed their heads against Maya, and the three of them stood together through the night, drawing strength from each other, preparing their minds and bodies and spirits for the battle to come. The Dominion fleet arrived at dawn. It was the most impressive and terrifying sight that any elf had ever witnessed. Over 100 ships filled the sky above Zerathia. They were arranged in formations designed to devastate everything below. They opened fire without waiting for demands or discussions, but the elves were ready. The shield spells, now powered by every mage the elves had, held firm. The attack was intense, but the shields held. The Dominion pilots realized that destroying the shields from orbit was going to be more difficult than they had anticipated. They began to prepare to land ground forces just as they had done before. This was Maya's moment. She took to the sky on Zephyr's back, with Onyx flying beside them, but this time she was not alone. Behind her came a squadron of elf warriors, mounted on griffins and other flying creatures that had been domesticated thousands of years ago. These warriors were experienced and brave. They carried weapons that had been forged in the ancient times when the elves were at the height of their magical power. The battle erupted across the sky. The Dominion fighters engaged the elf air force in a massive dogfight that stretched across hundreds of miles of open sky. The elf warriors, though fewer in number, had the advantage of superior maneuverability and knowledge of Zerathia's atmosphere. They used wind currents and weather patterns to their advantage. They flew through clouds and between canyons to confuse the Dominion pilots, but the Dominion had numbers and advanced weaponry on their side. For every Dominion fighter that was brought down, the elves lost warriors as well. The battle was brutal and costly. Bodies fell from the sky. Ships exploded in brilliant flashes of fire and light. The sky itself seemed to be tearing apart under the strain of so much violence. Maya focused on the massive central carrier, the flagship of the Dominion fleet. If they could destroy it, the coordination of the entire fleet would fall apart. The Dominion would lose their unified command structure. That was their only chance of victory. She guided Zephyr toward the flagship, but the path was blocked by dozens of attack fighters. The dragon had to fight through them, engaging in aerial combat with weapons that were not as powerful as his fire, but were more precise and rapid. Zephyr took damage, his scales being scored and cracked by energy weapons. Onyx fought beside him, protecting his flank and taking shots that might have hit her bonded partner. Finally, they broke through the Dominion defensive line. Zephyr and Onyx were now close to the flagship. They could see the weapons rotating to face them, preparing to open fire. This was the moment everything came down to. Maya felt the ancient magic stirring within her again. She knew that using it again would exact a price that she might not be able to pay. She had already used it once, and that had weakened her in ways that were only now healing. Using it a second time might destroy her permanently. It might even cost her her life. But she also knew that this was the only way to victory. She looked down at Zephyr and felt the connection between them, the bond that had grown stronger with every day they had spent together. She looked over at Onyx and felt the same connection, the same unbreakable link. She made her decision. "Zephyr, Onyx, I am going to need you both to trust me one more time," she said through their bond. "This will be dangerous. This will hurt. But if we succeed, our people will be free. Both dragons responded with their complete trust. They flew forward together, accelerating toward the flagship. The Dominion weapons opened fire, but the dragons moved with supernatural speed and grace. They dodged and weaved through the barrage of fire. They were no longer just creatures of flesh and scale. They were warriors of legend, beings of history and myth made real. Maya stood up on Zephyr's back as they flew. She raised her sword toward the sky. The ancient magic began to flow through her, filling every cell of her body with power that was beyond the understanding of modern science. Her eyes glowed with an inner light. Her sword began to shimmer and shine with colors that did not exist in the normal spectrum. The Dominion pilots saw the glow and felt fear for the first time in this war. They knew that something impossible was happening. They knew that they were facing forces that their weapons could not adequately oppose. Zephyr and Onyx flew directly toward the heart of the flagship. The bond between the three of them became so strong that they began to move as a single entity. Maya reached out her hand and touched both dragons at the same time, and the surge of power that flowed between them was like an explosion of pure magical force. They struck the flagship together. Maya's sword pierced through armor and technology and struck something vital in the very core of the ship. The energy unleashed in that moment spread through the entire vessel like a tidal wave. Systems that had been running for decades failed instantly. The ship's structure began to come apart at the seams. The Dominion crew had no time to react. They died without understanding what had killed them.